You've tuned in to the Locumstory Podcast, a place where we interview physicians, PAs, and NPs from all different specialties and backgrounds about their careers, tips for success, and of course, locum tenens. Learn more about locums at locumstory.com.
Welcome to another episode of the Locumstory Podcast. I'm Chase Johnson, and today we have the pleasure of talking with Dr. Jamila Goldsmith. Dr. Goldsmith is an emergency medicine physician and the host of the popular Locums Lounge podcast. She has made significant contributions to the locum tenens community, offering valuable experiences and insights through her podcast and her involvement with the American College of Emergency Physicians. Dr. Goldsmith, thanks for joining us today.
Thank you for having me.
Of course, it's our pleasure. Can you start by telling us a little bit about your background in emergency medicine and what initially inspired you to pursue this specialty?
So I trained at the University of Chicago and I completed residency in 2016. And I remember at the end of residency just trying to figure out what my next step was going to be. I had been involved with SAEM and it seemed like I was on an academic course. Like that's what everyone thought. I received awards, most outstanding future academician and all these things that I felt like I was kind of being put in a box. And I literally felt like I was suffocating. And I was like, I don't know if this is the route I want to go because I actually want to do this or that I am being groomed to do this. And so when trying to find a job, I did look at some community positions as well as interviewed for some academic spots. And I just felt like coming out of residency, number one, going into an academic role, I'm like, I just finished residency. Am I going to be enough to teach a new resident on day one, of coming out of residency, like how to be a good ER doctor? And I just didn't feel that I was. Like I wanted to get out and get some experience and figure out how Jamila functioned as an ER doctor before I came back into a role to teach anyone else. And so locums came about as I was like toiling with these decisions on whether I would take a community job or going to academics. And I met one of my mentors and she was telling me about how she had spent years in academics and started doing locums and loved it.
Cool.
And she talked to me about the benefits of it. And I was like, you know what, that seems like something that I might want to try and just learn about myself as a doctor. And then maybe I'll want to do an academic job later on. Maybe I'll be able to bring something to the table once I, get some experience in different settings practicing. So that's how it started. And it was supposed to be a 1-year gig where I, got out there, got my feet wet, and then figured out what I wanted to do long term.
Excellent. And so I don't want to foreshadow here, but it sounds like that 1 year turned into 7, 8, 9 years.
Yeah. Yep.
Okay.
It's been 8 years that I've been majority practicing locums. During the pandemic, I did take a full-time job briefly, but I think most people were scrambling around that time. And as soon as the market picked back up, I was, back at it again.
So you mentioned that you kind of became familiar with it through your mentor. Had they done locums before? Were they full-time locums kind of similar to how you're practicing, or what was their...
So they started out traditional pathway working in academics. And then I think my understanding is that they just needed something different. They needed a change. They wanted some more freedom. And so now she does practice full-time locums. And so That's who I tap on for advice if I need anything. And yeah, that was my first introduction. And then I also, so let me give credit where credit is due. So that was one of my first introductions. And then some of my classmates who had taken traditional jobs got into contracts that were not what they were sold to be. Some of them got into jobs and, their CMG sold to another company, contracts changing. Now you're forced into a contract that may not be ideal just because you want to keep a job.
Sure.
And so they found themselves unhappy in their roles. And that was pretty much at least 3 of my good friends' experience. And so they started doing locums. It was my last year of residency. They were a year ahead of me. So they were already practicing and they're like, Jamila, don't even waste your time. Just try this. And so I think that gave me some confidence to just say, okay, let me see what I can do with this and see if I can make it work. So
I love it. That's great. I was listening to your podcast earlier this morning, and you mentioned that, you did this right out of residency. I imagine you would get questions like, why are you doing locums? When are you going to get a real job? How did you feel some of those comments? And do you feel that those comments became less and less as time went on, or maybe walk us through that?
I think that when I actually sat into like knowing that this is my business, that I am my business and this is what I do, and I'm owning it as this is my choice, those questions are less. Like, I don't get those questions much at all. But early in my career, it was like, okay, you having fun. Now when you're going to get a real job? I did get
Sure.
that question a lot early on. And I did feel the pressure. It made me feel like, oh my gosh, like I'm out here non-committed. And like, it made me feel a little anxious, like, okay, I still haven't found something that fits, even though I really had found the thing that fit for me, and it's locums. So yeah, early on got those questions quite a bit, and like now so much, not at all. More so questions are like, how do you make it work? How can I get into it?
Cool.
So,
That's great. Let me ask, is the academic route still on the table, or is that door kind of closed, or is there less interest in it, or?
so it's interesting because I tell people, like, you create your path and what you want to do. And I think the misconception is that if you start a job in the community, you can never go into academics. And surely if you start a job in locums, like, you can't get into academics. I have picked up contracts in academics. So maybe not long term, but enough that I'm like, okay, I do like to teach, and I do like working with residents. I like speaking to residents. I like mentorship. And although I don't see myself full time in an academic role, not at this point in my life, and I can't say what 10 years down the line what I might feel, but right now it's not something that is like on my mind, like I see myself doing that at this point. But I get enough of it with some of the contracts that I've been able to pick up that I feel fulfilled in that area, that I'm still connected with some of the future ER doctors that are out there, and I see them at ASAP. And it's interesting because some of them listen to my podcast and are interested. They don't hear enough or see enough doctors doing what I'm doing. And so it's always fun to kind of, give them a little exposure and answer their questions when I'm doing some of those types of contracts.
That's excellent. So it feels like you're kind of getting the best of both worlds. You get that academic side. You also get to practice the way that you want to practice.
Exactly.
Yeah. That's great. Tell me about how you're coordinating your locum tenens assignments. Are you finding those on your own? Are you partnering with an agency, or how does that work?
So it's a mixture of things. I started locums working primarily with a boutique agency that pretty much found all my jobs. And I think starting out, that was easy for me because I didn't really know what I was doing. I was getting my feet wet, and I didn't really understand some of the intricacies of sending your CV out. You shouldn't do that. Or, I just didn't understand the business side of locums. And so it was easy to start out that way. Now that I'm more comfortable, I still have the boutique agency, but I also work with some of the other larger locums companies. One of the things that I feel is an advantage in being able to be the chair of the ASAP locum tenens section is working with other doctors who have found different ways to make locums work for them. Some people are negotiating directly with the hospital, and I'm not in that space yet, but learning more about that. So right now it's just, I work with a number of different agencies. I like to tell people nobody owns me.
Good.
Nobody owns me. I, pick and choose who I want to work with, and it gives me some leverage in choosing the best assignments for me, as opposed to being thrown into a situation that I may or may not like. So
excellent. I love that. That's great. Can you walk us through a typical day in the life for you as a full-time locums? How much are you frequenting the same facilities? How often is it new? Are you looking for things that are nearby? Or how do you go in deciding what assignments make sense for?
So that has evolved over the time that I've been doing locums. So I started out locums a single woman with no kids. And so now I am a mom of a 3-year-old boy. And so that has caused me to have to adjust how, I think I have more boundaries with the types of assignments that I'll do. when I first started out, I picked up a ton of licenses. Some of them were like telemedicine jobs, but because I have the license and I do telemedicine in the state, sure, I'm open to traveling there to do a contract if the price is right and it's the right situation. Now I am more regional. So I'm based in Atlanta. And because I'm a mom, I have strict constraints on like how many days I'll work straight. Like I'm not working more than 3 or 4 shifts back to back so that I can get in and get out. Whereas there were like back in the day, I would work maybe 5 or 6 shifts straight. And my month would look like maybe 16 shifts per month. Now I would die if I had to do 16 shifts a month. And some months I do work a little bit more depending on if I'm planning a vacation or I have some financial goals, then I may pick up a little bit more. But my sweet spot right now is like 9 to 10 shifts a month.
Awesome.
And so that looks like maybe travel once, maybe twice a month, and then some local contracts that I can drive to and work a few days to fill in the gaps. So
that's great. It's awesome to hear that you've kind of migrated the locums lifestyle to your current situation. I feel like a lot of folks will take locums and say this is good for a point in time, but you've kind of massaged it to be this is what my life looks like today, and I'm going to make this work. So that's great.
And I feel like I'm grateful for my experience that I had working full time in a role, because it allowed me to see the blessings in locums a little bit more. Because even though I worked locally and I was in one spot, I felt like I worked much more. And even when I was at home, I was still working. I was an associate director, but I was still working a lot. And the time that I was at home, it wasn't quality time.
Sure.
Either I was too tired, I was post shift. It was just like, not having as much control over my schedule and how I block my time out now. There's no like scattered few days in there where the next day is really not your own. You're sleeping or trying to catch up. So those are not, I feel like that's stuff almost still work, because you pretty much miss your whole next day. So now I have control to be able to like figure out how to put those days in there so that when I'm home, like my Wednesdays are off limits. Those are my son's swim lesson days. And I make sure that I plan my life first, and then my job I schedule around what's most important.
Fantastic. That's great. Tell me a little bit about how you landed in that W-2 position during the COVID-19 pandemic. I understand, life was probably very tumultuous, I would guess, for an emergency medicine physician. Did shifts dry up, or how did you land in that spot?
So I think, to summarize, people who were in full-time positions were finding themselves, their companies were trying to renegotiate their contracts and change their rates and take away some benefits. So I think in general, most companies were looking at how to save during that time. And one of the savings was most expensive help goes first, which is locums, of course. And so some of my long-standing contracts, and you asked this question, how long do I stay in a place? My active contracts that I have now, I've been there for like 2 or almost 3 years, the same places. But and prior to the pandemic, that was the same case. I'd been in these places for quite some time. Some of them were just starting out new, and of course they were, cutting shifts. And some of my like tried and true places were like trying to prioritize the shifts for their full-time employees. And so just different, like the whole environment of locums changed, because there were companies that were doing shady stuff, like looking at their contracts and figuring out how can they cancel and not pay. And so it was just very shaky during that time. And so I was fortunate to be able to work. I worked with the Indian Health Service. And so I would travel to Arizona and South Dakota and work shifts there. So I had work. It just, the ability to pick and choose where I wanted to be was not as, plentiful during that time.
That's fair. Yeah.
So
good call out.
So I ended up saying, okay, what's the next course in my career? It was a somewhat of a choice, like, okay, well, maybe it is time to get that full time, that real job. What would be the next thing? And so that's how I ended up in leadership and in a full-time job. So
Excellent. Thanks for walking us through that. What would you say you find the most rewarding about locum tenens work? I want to guess at it before you give me the answer. And my guess is that you have the flexibility to be with your son, be a family person first and work second. But I kind of want to hear it from you.
yeah, I would say that is, you hit it spot on. Having that freedom and flexibility to travel and spend time with my family and be my own boss and make adjustments that are good for me when I need to make those, and not negotiating that with anyone else
Great.
or begging for that, I think I need a little time off. Like knowing myself and being able to take control and say, hey, you know what? I'm going to take a couple weeks off. I'm going to cut my shifts down, and not having to bargain with anyone for that time.
Yeah, great. I love that. What are some of the unique challenges or opportunities that you've encountered while working as a locums physician? I would assume that COVID-19 experience was definitely a challenge, but anything else that you would highlight in terms of, maybe a highlight and a low light?
Okay. So let's see. Highlight. Highlight is that I enjoy showing up to a hospital and them looking forward to me, like, oh, we know we're gonna have a good shift. We're gonna have a good weekend. Dr. Goldsmith is here. We're gonna be all right. And knowing that, being someone who's not a permanent fixture in, these hospital settings, and being able to bring that amount of comfort to people that I don't work with very often, that feels good. It's like, okay, like the contrast. There have been very few assignments where, like, I know this is not a good match. Where I always tell people, when you are going into a locum assignment, there's something wrong. Either the thing that's wrong, maybe that it's a toxic environment and that's why no one wants to work there, or maybe there's some issues that just make it a hard place to work. Or it could be that they just can't get people to that particular location. Not that the people are bad, not that the hospital is bad, it's just not like ideally located.
Sure.
So I've been in places that have been toxic, and it's like, no matter how much positivity I bring in here, no matter how much I'm like my authentic self coming in, you are an outsider and we're gonna give you a hard time.
Yeah, sure.
So you have those experiences, and I think that when people think about locums, because sometimes that is one of the things that people talk about as being like one of the downsides of doing it, that people think that is just it. I'm going to go to these new places and people are not going to treat me good and I'm going to have a hard time adjusting. But that's not the majority of my experience.
Okay, good. So, it sounds like in that first example that you walk into a place and you probably feel like a rock star because you're wanted. Yeah, you're valued.
Yeah, like they are looking forward to me coming. I've had one of my current assignments, some of the people will come in on their day off if they know I'm working. Whoa. Just to like sit and talk with me. So
that's awesome.
I love that. Like that's the plus. You want to go to work and feel that people want you there. So
yeah, big time. That's great. Switching gears a little bit, you're the creator and host of the Locums Lounge podcast. What inspired you to start the podcast, and what's that journey been like so far?
So what inspired me? I love talking to people about what I've been able to find, like the pluses that I've been able to find in my career in doing locums. And whenever I talk to people and I tell them what I do, they're always like, well, I never knew that was even a thing. Like, so basically you're like a traveling doctor, like there's traveling nurses. I'm like, well, yeah, you could think of it that way. But when I'm talking to, medical students or residents, and they don't hear much about this, in their training, and they're like, I'm curious about this. How do you make that work? Like, you're living the life that seems like I want to have. And so I wanted to be able to like talk about that and talk about some of the mindset shifts that are involved with being able to step out and say, hey, I'm going to be my own boss and I'm going to step outside the box. Because I know if you go to a heavily academic program, they want you to go to a fellowship. They want you to go to pick a nice full-time job, like maybe in the community. So like there's the pressures of that. And then being able to say, okay, I'm going to do my own thing. Like that takes a lot.
Big time. Yeah.
It takes a lot.
Yeah, especially it's not a traditional path, and people have to they do have to think out of the box and figure out what's right for them. And that can be hard. You kind of discuss on the podcast the importance of embracing discomfort. Could you tell us a little bit more about what that means to you and maybe what advice you'd give to others to facilitate that for themselves?
Yeah. So even like going off of what I was just saying about stepping outside the box, like it was uncomfortable saying, okay, I've never done this before. I really don't know much about it, but there are other people who are doing it and I'm capable of doing it as well. And so it was uncomfortable stepping into new territory and creating my own path. But on the other side of that is like I've been able to find joy in my career and I've been able to prioritize things that are of value to me.
Excellent.
And so there always has to be a little bit discomfort on one side to get to like the joy or the benefits of it. You got to struggle a little bit to get to the place that you want to be. That's what anything. Think about like medical school, like that was a struggle. Okay, but on the other side of that, you know, is this fulfilling career for most people. And like, you know, it's always, you got to put in the work. And sometimes that work is uncomfortable. So
Great. Excellent call out. Looking ahead, what are you thinking your future looks like with Locum Tenens work, future of the podcast? Yeah. Walk us through what future Dr. Goldsmith looks like.
Yeah. So I love, you know, I did the podcast really, it was an outlet for me to just get out what I'm doing and to, you know, impact others. And I didn't realize how much it was actually going to impact others until I'm in these assignments and people are like, oh yeah. Or I show up to ATLS a couple weeks ago and someone's asking me about locums and they're like, I'm like, check out my podcast. Oh yeah, I already listened. I'm following. So it's like, wow. So I would like to see my podcast grow more. I also do coaching. I help doctors who are trying to navigate, you know, the whole landscape of locums. How do I set up my business? How do I approach, you know, working with different recruiters? So there's that aspect. And then with ASEP, Locum Tenens section, we just have, you know, voted in some really awesome officers that have great ideas. And we're looking forward to putting out information for people who have to transition into something different, maybe by choice or not by choice. So I just want to get information out to people, let them know that this is an option, that it's a viable option, and make sure people, you know, have the tools that they can be successful. So
excellent. How, I want to give you a plug. How would someone get a hold of you for coaching or anything like that? Anything in relation to what we've talked about today?
So yeah, just, you know, I have Instagram. Just, you know, send me a DM on Instagram and I'm able to sit down, have a talk, and just hit me up on Instagram. That's the best way. Okay.
We'll drop a link in the show notes. Yeah. Finally, for those early career physicians that are listening to the podcast, what advice would you give to them if they're thinking about pursuing locums right out of training?
So right out of training, people will say, oh, you need to get in with one spot, figure out, get comfortable working. And I think there's a couple different ways to look at it. For me, I knew I needed to study for boards. And I wanted to have the freedom to be like, okay, I'm going to take this month off and just study for boards. I want to be able to do that. And I still want to work. So I was able to fix my schedule in a way that it was helpful for that. Also, just looking at when you're in training, a lot of times you're thrown into situations that you don't choose the hospitals you work in. You just get put in there and you adapt easily and you make it work. So there's something about coming out of residency and having that flexibility to be like, okay, I can, you know, adapt to this new environment and I can make that work, versus being in one place, working with the same people and getting comfortable. It makes it more uncomfortable for you to get to go into new environments because you're used to the people around you. So I think the plus into doing it right out of residency is that your mind is still in resident mode.
Yeah.
And you're still in the mode of like switching rotations, switching hospitals. And so that makes it a little bit easier to approach locums. The doctoring part you have, believe it or not, we have that down. And it's a little bit uncomfortable at first, but that doesn't change with the hospital environment. That's just something that you have to work on with yourself and becoming more comfortable with your skills as a doctor. So I wouldn't let that I wouldn't let the idea of going into a new place deter me from starting locum straight out of residency. I think it's actually the best time to start locum straight out of residency.
Yeah, it's a great call out, especially I haven't really heard that comparison with all the rotations and things like that you're basically set up to do this a lot easier than someone who's practiced for 10, 15 years. So.
Yeah, definitely. Even a year in one place will get you really comfortable and like, okay, can I go to this new hospital? But yeah, I think your mind is more malleable to going to these different places right out of residency.
Excellent. Well, Dr. Goldsmith, it's been a pleasure speaking with you today. Anything else you want to call out before we wrap up?
No, it's been a pleasure being here with you. I'm willing to come back anytime. Locumstory was one of the places that I looked when I was like, okay, who is out here doing stuff? So want to give you kudos to what you're doing with your podcast and, being a resource for people who are looking into doing locum. So
awesome. Well, that's music to our ears for sure. So thank you again for joining us, and hopefully it's the first of many. Let's do it again.
Definitely. Thank you.
This has been the Locumstory Podcast. To learn more about locum tenens and find additional provider stories, visit locumstory.com.